Everyone in Nocturith believed the Vampire King's daughter had been born profoundly disabled. For centuries, no one questioned it. Not the castle physicians with their ancient remedies, not the scholars with their dusty grimoires, not even King Valus Draven himself. She existed in perpetual helplessness, unable to walk, unable to speak clearly, cut off from the world of movement and independence, hidden away in a fortress built on sorrow and candlelight. But everything changed the night a new maid was summoned from the mortal realm. She wasn't a healer or a mystic, just someone who paid attention. What she noticed during her quiet service in the shadowed halls, during those intimate moments of bathing, feeding, and caring for the princess, would unravel centuries of enchantment, challenge an immortal king's desperate choices, and bring to light a truth that had been sealed since the night the little princess first drew breath. What began as simple duty turned into a dangerous quest. And what she uncovered would shock everyone, especially the father who thought he had done everything to protect his only child. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to know. King Valus Draven was an immortal ruler feared across realms, known throughout the supernatural world for his iron will and merciless reign. But behind the legend of his power, he lived a very different existence within his castle walls. He resided in Draven Castle, a massive Gothic fortress isolated in the perpetual twilight of Nocturith, where he dwelt alone with his daughter, Seraphine. The castle was magnificent, towering stone archways, crimson tapestries depicting ancient battles, vast halls lit by thousands of candles, and endless corridors that seemed to breathe with shadows. Yet, despite its grandeur, it felt frozen in grief, more tomb than home. Valus had lost his beloved wife during a blood eclipse centuries ago. On the very night Princess Seraphine was born, that catastrophic event had shattered something fundamental in him. He had withdrawn from the vampire courts, refused diplomatic summons, and severed ties with allied kingdoms. Not because he sought solitude, but because he could no longer bear the weight of the outside world. His entire existence now revolved around Seraphine. She was the only being in all the realms he truly cared for, and he devoted every waking hour to ensuring her safety and comfort. But Seraphine's condition made his devotion feel like an endless, impossible task. From the moment of her birth, it was believed she had been born disabled, her body unable to support itself, her limbs seemingly without strength, her speech limited to incomplete sounds and wordless cries. She appeared as an eternal infant despite having existed for over 300 years. Valus blamed himself for the curse, convinced that his wife's death and Seraphine's disability were divine punishment for his defiance of celestial law. His nights were consumed with ancient routines, heavy silence, and constant dread about what would become of her when he could no longer protect her. Despite filling the castle with enchanted tools, rare artifacts meant to stimulate her development, and summoning healers from every corner of the known world, Seraphine showed little progress. Valus had called upon witches, mystics, and even angels in disguise, hoping someone might reach through the veil that separated his daughter from normal existence. But nothing changed. Seraphine rarely responded to stimuli. She didn't play with toys or show interest in her surroundings. She never smiled or laughed. Most of her time was spent lying in her ornate cradle or being carried through the castle in her father's arms, her body limp and unresponsive, her large blue eyes staring into the void, never settling on any object or person. It was as though she existed in a dimension no one else could enter, trapped behind an invisible wall. Valus often positioned himself beside her cradle, silently watching her for hours, drowning in helplessness. He read to her from ancient grimoires, told her stories of her mother's grace and beauty, even played haunting melodies on a centuries-old violin. But she rarely reacted. Only occasionally would her fingers twitch slightly, or her eyes would shift as if tracking some invisible presence. Those fleeting gestures were all Velis had to cling to. He wondered endlessly whether she recognized his voice, whether she felt anything at all, or if she was lost forever in the cursed fog that consumed her body and mind. At over 900 years old, King Velis looked like a man in his early 40s, though weariness had aged his features beyond even a mortal endurance. His long silver-white hair, once pristine, now fell in waves past his shoulders. His crimson eyes, which had once burned with conquest and passion, now seemed dim, shadowed by grief. His movements were deliberate and slow, like a man carrying the weight of empires on his spine. He had distanced himself from old allies, ignored invitations to blood councils, and delegated ruling responsibilities to his advisors. He couldn't bring himself to leave Seraphine's side for more than a few hours. Every evening, he followed the same sacred ritual. He would personally bathe Seraphine in a porcelain tub filled with warm water and fragrant oils, his ancient hands infinitely gentle as he cleaned her pale skin. He would dress her in soft infant gowns made of the finest silk, his fingers working carefully around her limp limbs. He would prepare her meals, warmed milk, honey water, soft bread soaked until it could be fed to her in tiny portions. He would carry her through the castle's cold stone halls, cradling her against his chest as he described the world she seemed unable to comprehend. He tried endlessly to reach her through textures, silk scarves brushed against her skin, rough bark from the garden pressed into her palm, cool metal of ancient coins placed in her fingers. He tried through scents, night-blooming jasmine, burning sage, crushed rose petals. He tried through music, both sorrowful and sweet, playing melodies that had once made his wife weep with joy. But nothing penetrated the wall around her. There were moments when rage consumed him, when he shouted at the heavens, cursed the gods who had taken his wife, and left him with this unbearable burden. He often knelt beside Seraphine's cradle and whispered broken apologies, as if she could hear the anguish bleeding from his immortal heart. Even with all his ancient power, all his forbidden knowledge and accumulated wealth, he could not undo what he saw as the greatest failure of his endless life, his daughter's suffering and her impenetrable prison of helplessness. The castle staff was small and carefully chosen, bound by blood oaths to discretion. They respected Velis's need for privacy and rarely spoke unless summoned. Most had served the Draven family for generations, watching Seraphine exist through the years without any visible change. They whispered among themselves in the servants' quarters, sharing observations about small, strange details, how the princess's eyes sometimes seemed to follow movement when she thought no one was watching, how her fingers would occasionally grasp with surprising strength before going limp again, how she would sometimes make soft sounds that resembled words rather than infant babbling. But to Velis, these fragments felt like cruel reminders of what might have been. He yearned for more. He wanted to hear her speak his name with recognition, to see her smile with joy, to watch her take even a single step on her own. He wanted to know that somewhere within that fragile body, his daughter was truly present and aware. Sometimes he would sit beside her for hours, speaking aloud about his day, recounting memories of his wife's laughter, or describing the way moonlight painted silver across the valley beyond their walls. He desperately hoped that something he said might pierce through the veil, that one word might unlock the prison holding her captive. But Seraphine remained mostly still and silent, offering only the occasional slight movement of her head or fingers. Velis clung to those tiny signs like a drowning man clutches driftwood, praying they meant more than they appeared to. The castle itself had become a monument to everything Velis had lost. It was vast enough to house an entire court, yet only 2 souls truly inhabited its endless chambers. Every room carried the ghost of memory or the shadow of hope that never fully materialized. The nursery remained exactly as Seraphine's mother had designed it before her birth, soft lavender walls, hand-painted stars across the ceiling, a rocking chair positioned near the cradle, delicate curtains that had never been opened. Veles had forbidden anyone from altering a single detail after the eclipse. Sometimes he stood in the doorway for what felt like hours, drowning in memories he refused to release. Seraphine had never shown any interest in exploration or discovery. She never reached for toys, never asked questions through gesture or sound, never seemed to comprehend the world that surrounded her. Veles had accepted this strange, suffocating existence as his eternal penance. Yet, deep in the parts of himself he dared not examine, he still believed something might shift. He studied every new theory on mystical afflictions, consulted with scholars from distant lands, and attempted experimental rituals drawn from forbidden texts. But each attempt ended in the same crushing disappointment. Still, he refused to surrender completely. And so the centuries continued in their slow, agonizing rhythm. Veles remained bound to Seraphine, though he barely rested and rarely knew peace. He still bathed her with infinite care, dressed her in the softest gowns, fed her by hand with patience that defied his immortal nature, and carried her through the moonlit gardens while whispering stories she couldn't seem to understand. Seraphine remained silent and motionless, her porcelain face showing almost no expression, her large blue eyes forever unfocused, staring at nothing. Her body lay limp in his arms like a beautiful doll, devoid of the strength and vitality that should have been her birthright. Yet every so often, she would make a small sound, not quite a word, but something close. Or her tiny hand would grasp his finger for just a moment before releasing. Those rare gestures gave Veles the strength to endure another day, another year, another century if necessary. He didn't know what fate had planned, but he had made an unbreakable vow to protect her, to care for her, to be everything she needed for all of eternity. No matter the cost to himself, no matter the isolation, no matter the grief that threatened to consume him with each passing night. In that lonely fortress shrouded in eternal dusk, King Veles Draven lived each night for the silent child who never demanded anything, never complained, never wept. His daughter Seraphine, who lay so quietly in her cradle or rested motionlessly in his arms, always with that same vacant, haunting stare, the eternal infant who had existed for over 3 centuries without ever taking a single step, without ever speaking a single clear word, without ever truly living in the world her father so desperately wanted to share with her. And so the nights passed, one after another, in that castle of shadows and sorrow, where an immortal king served as eternal caretaker to a daughter trapped in perpetual helplessness, or so everyone believed. Until the night a young maid named Cecilia arrived and began to notice things that no one else had dared to see. Cecilia arrived at Draven Castle on a night when the moon hung low and crimson in the perpetual twilight sky, carrying nothing but a worn traveling bag and a grief so fresh it felt like an open wound. She was 23 years old, with auburn hair that caught the candlelight in waves of copper and gold, and eyes that had learned to notice the small things, the subtle shifts in breathing, the fleeting expressions that crossed a dying person's face, the moments when hope flickered and then guttered out like a candle in the wind. Her younger sister had died 3 months earlier. Wasting illness, the doctors had called it, though they'd offered no real explanation and no effective treatment. Cecilia had followed every instruction they'd given, administered every prescribed medicine, maintained every ordered routine. She'd been obedient, dutiful, trusting in their expertise even as she watched her sister grow thinner and paler with each passing day. And in the end, her sister had slipped away in the middle of the night while Cecilia slept in the chair beside her bed, too exhausted to keep vigil any longer. The guilt had been crushing. She should have questioned more, pushed harder, demanded better answers. She should have trusted her own observations when she noticed the treatments weren't working. She'd promised herself, standing over her sister's grave in the cold rain, that she would never again stand by silently while someone suffered. Never again would she choose obedience over instinct, protocol over what her own eyes told her was true. But promises made in grief were easier spoken than kept, and Cecilia needed work. The position at Draven Castle had appeared like an answer to an unspoken prayer: room, board, and wages in exchange for service. She hadn't known, when she'd accepted, that she would be assigned to care for the king's daughter. She hadn't known about Princess Seraphine at all. The head steward, a gaunt vampire named Greer with hollow cheeks and eyes like tarnished silver, showed her to the servants' quarters with clipped efficiency. His instructions were precise and left no room for questions. She would serve as the princess's personal attendant. She would bathe her, dress her, feed her, maintain her comfort. She would follow the king's routines exactly as established. She would speak only when spoken to and would never, under any circumstances, discuss the princess's condition with anyone outside the castle walls. "The princess is very delicate," Greer said, his voice flat and cold. "His Majesty is very protective. You would do well to simply perform your duties and ask no questions." The other servants echoed the warning in whispers when Greer was out of earshot. "The princess doesn't like noise," one of the vampire maids told her. "The king doesn't tolerate mistakes," said another. "Just do exactly as you're told, and you'll be fine." But there was something in their eyes when they spoke of Seraphine, not quite pity, not quite fear, but something that made Cecilia's instincts prickle with unease. Her first meeting with Princess Seraphine came the following evening, just after twilight deepened into full night. Greer led her up a spiraling stone staircase that seemed to climb forever, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. The princess's chambers occupied the highest floor of the East Tower, accessible only by that single narrow passage. When Greer pushed open the heavy oak door, Cecilia stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The room was beautiful in a haunting, sorrowful way. Velvet curtains the color of deep wine framed tall, arched windows. Candles burned in iron sconces along the walls, casting dancing shadows across oil paintings of long-dead royalty. A four-poster bed draped in silver silk dominated one corner, though it looked as if it had never been slept in. And near the window sat an ornate cradle carved from dark wood and lined with the softest bedding Cecilia had ever seen. In that cradle lay Princess Seraphine. Cecilia moved closer, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet, and looked down at the child everyone said had existed for over 300 years. Seraphine appeared to be perhaps 6 months old, pale as porcelain, with delicate features and large blue eyes that stared upward at nothing. Her tiny body lay motionless in a cream-colored gown of the finest silk, her limbs positioned with careful symmetry. She didn't move when Cecilia approached, didn't track her movement or show any sign of awareness. But she was breathing. And somewhere in those unfocused eyes, Cecilia thought she saw something, a flicker, perhaps, or just a reflection of candlelight. She couldn't be sure. "You will bathe her each evening," Greer said from the doorway. "The king has laid out everything you'll need. Follow his methods precisely." Then he left, and Cecilia was alone with the princess for the first time. The bathing routine was elaborate and clearly designed with infinite care. A porcelain tub sat in an adjoining chamber, already filled with warm water that smelled of lavender and chamomile. Soft cloths were folded beside it, along with gentle soap and oils. Cecilia lifted Seraphine from the cradle. The child was impossibly light, like holding a bundle of silk and air, and carried her to the bath. Seraphine remained completely limp in her arms, head lolling, limbs hanging loose. Cecilia lowered her carefully into the warm water, supporting her head and back the way she'd once bathed her baby cousins. The princess's eyes stayed open but unfocused, staring at the vaulted ceiling as Cecilia gently washed her pale skin. It was during this first bath that Cecilia noticed something strange. She'd been reaching for the soap when it slipped from her wet fingers and tumbled toward the water with a soft splash. Cecilia startled, jerking slightly, and in that instant, so brief she almost missed it, Seraphine's legs pushed against the edge of the tub. Not reflexively, but with deliberate pressure, as if trying to brace herself. Her tiny body had tensed for just a heartbeat before going completely limp again. Cecilia froze, so forgotten, staring at the princess. Had that really happened? Had those seemingly useless legs actually supported weight, if only for a moment? Or had it been her imagination, grief, and exhaustion making her see things that weren't there? She finished the bath in silence, watching Seraphine carefully for any other sign of movement. But the princess remained utterly still, her expression blank, her body unresponsive. Cecilia dressed her in a fresh nightgown, carried her back to the cradle, and tried to convince herself she'd imagined it. Later that evening, when she brought Seraphine's meal, warmed milk in a delicate silver bottle, something else happened. Cecilia was positioning the bottle against the princess's lips, supporting her head with one hand, when Seraphine's tiny fingers suddenly wrapped around Cecilia's wrist. The grip was strong, startlingly strong, with a pressure that seemed impossible for an infant. Cecilia nearly dropped the bottle in surprise. But before she could react, the fingers released and Seraphine's hand fell limp once more. "Did you?" Cecilia began, but stopped herself. The princess stared at nothing with those vast blue eyes, showing no awareness that anything had happened. "Seeing things that aren't there, are we?" The voice came from the doorway, deep and cold as winter stone. Cecilia spun to find King Valus standing in the shadows, his silver-white hair catching the candlelight like a halo, his crimson eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. She hadn't heard him approach, hadn't sensed his presence at all. "Your Majesty," she stammered, dropping into a hasty curtsy. "I was just feeding my daughter." "Yes." He moved into the room with fluid grace, each step deliberate and silent. "I've been observing your technique. You're gentle with her. That's good." He crossed to the cradle and looked down at Seraphine with an expression of such profound sadness that Cecilia felt her chest tighten. "But I must warn you not to mistake reflex for awareness, Miss Cecilia. My daughter's condition is unchangeable. I have consulted with the greatest minds in all the realms, attempted every possible treatment, exhausted every avenue of hope." His eyes lifted to meet hers, and there was something terrible in their depths, not quite a threat, but a warning nonetheless. "Do not give yourself false hope by seeing things that aren't there. It will only make your service here more painful." "I understand, Your Majesty," Cecilia said quietly, though she wasn't sure she understood anything at all. Valus studied her for a long moment, then nodded once and departed as silently as he'd arrived, leaving Cecilia alone with the princess and her swirling confusion. That night, lying on her narrow cot in the servants' quarters, Cecilia couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to those two moments, the legs pushing against the tub, the fingers gripping her wrist. Had they been reflexes, as the king suggested? Or had there been something more deliberate in those movements? She was still wrestling with these thoughts when she heard it, soft and clear through the silence of the sleeping castle, drifting down from somewhere above. Humming. Not the wordless babbling of an infant, but an actual melody, haunting and sweet, sung in a voice that carried the weight of consciousness and intention. It was coming from the East Tower, from Princess Seraphine's chamber. Cecilia sat up in her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. Around her, the other servants slept on, undisturbed. But Cecilia remained frozen, listening to that impossible sound, and wondering what truth lay hidden behind 3 centuries of accepted helplessness. Cecilia couldn't ignore what she'd heard. That humming, clear and melodic and utterly impossible, echoed through her thoughts all through the following day. She moved through her other duties in a fog of distraction, scrubbing floors and polishing silver while her mind circled endlessly around the same questions. Had it really been Seraphine? Could an infant who couldn't even lift her own head produce such a hauntingly beautiful sound? Or had exhaustion and grief finally caught up with her, making her hear things that existed only in her imagination? But then she remembered the legs pushing against the tub, the fingers gripping her wrist with startling strength. Those hadn't been imaginings. She was certain of that. which meant there was something happening here that no one was acknowledging, something hidden beneath the surface of accepted truth. She decided to observe more carefully, to pay attention the way she should have paid attention during her sister's illness, before it was too late to make a difference. On the first day of her private investigation, she watched Seraphine during the evening dressing routine. She took her time selecting a fresh nightgown from the carved wardrobe, letting the silk slide through her fingers while she kept the princess in her peripheral vision. Seraphine lay in her cradle exactly as she always did, motionless, eyes unfocused, limbs arranged in that careful symmetry. When Cecilia lifted her to change her clothes, the child's body remained completely limp, head lolling, arms hanging loose. No unusual movements. No signs of hidden awareness. Perhaps she really had imagined everything. On the second day, during the evening feeding, Cecilia tried something different. She was positioning the silver spoon near Seraphine's lips when she deliberately let it slip from her fingers. The spoon clattered against the stone floor and skittered several feet away, well beyond the princess's reach. Cecilia watched carefully, holding her breath, waiting to see if Seraphine would react, turn her head toward the sound, reach for it, show any sign of awareness that something had fallen. Nothing. The princess continued staring at the ceiling with those vast blue eyes, expression blank, body utterly still. If she'd heard the spoon fall, she gave no indication whatsoever. Cecilia retrieved the spoon and finished the feeding in silence, doubt creeping back into her mind. Maybe the king was right. Maybe she was seeing things that weren't there, projecting hope onto a situation where none existed. Maybe grief had made her desperate to save someone, anyone, even if that someone didn't need or want saving. But on the third evening, she decided to try one more thing. She went through the bathing routine as usual, washing Seraphine's pale skin with gentle efficiency while the princess lay limp in the warm water. After drying her and dressing her in a soft nightgown, Cecilia carried her back to the cradle and arranged her carefully among the silk bedding. Then, in a voice loud enough to be clearly heard, she announced, "I need to fetch fresh water for the morning. I'll return shortly." She walked to the door, pulled it open, and let it close again with a soft click, but she didn't leave. Instead, she pressed herself against the wall beside the doorway, barely breathing, and watched through the gap between the door and its frame. For a long moment, nothing happened. Seraphine lay exactly as Cecilia had left her, motionless and still. The candles flickered in their sconces. Shadows danced across the vaulted ceiling. The silence was so complete that Cecilia could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Then, slowly, Seraphine's fingers began to move. It wasn't a reflex or a random twitch. The movement was deliberate, experimental, her tiny fingers flexing and curling, opening and closing as if testing their own strength. Her right hand lifted slightly from the bedding, turned at the wrist, then lowered again. Then her left leg shifted position beneath the silk covering, bending at the knee before straightening once more. Cecilia's breath caught in her throat. She watched, transfixed, as the supposedly helpless princess explored her own body with cautious, controlled movements. Testing. Experimenting. Moving in ways that should have been impossible for someone with her condition. Without thinking, Cecilia stepped forward into the room. Seraphine. The effect was instantaneous. The princess's body went completely limp, her movements ceasing so abruptly it was as if someone had cut invisible strings. Her fingers splayed loose against the bedding. Her leg settled back into position. And her eyes, those large blue eyes that had seemed almost focused a moment before, became vacant and unfocused once more, staring at nothing. "I saw you," Cecilia said softly, approaching the cradle. "I saw you move. I know you can control your body." Seraphine gave no response. She might as well have been a beautiful doll, artfully arranged but ultimately lifeless. Cecilia knelt beside the cradle, bringing herself to eye level with the princess. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered. And I'm not going to tell anyone if that's what you're afraid of. I just want to understand. Still nothing. But Cecilia had spent months watching her sister hide pain behind forced smiles, had learned to recognize the subtle signs of consciousness masked by physical limitation. And she could see it now, in the slight tension around Seraphine's eyes, in the too careful stillness of her body. The princess was listening, understanding, choosing not to respond. That evening's bath routine felt different. Cecilia moved through the familiar motions, filling the tub, testing the water temperature, gathering the soft cloths and gentle soap, but her mind was racing with possibilities. When she lifted Seraphine from the cradle and carried her to the bathing chamber, she made a decision. As she lowered the princess into the warm water, she began to speak. Not the meaningless chatter people often directed at infants, but real words meant for someone who could understand them. "I know you can hear me," she said softly, supporting Seraphine's head above the water. "I know you understand more than they think you do. I've seen the way your body responds when you think no one's watching. The way you moved in your cradle." Seraphine remained motionless, eyes fixed on the ceiling, but Cecilia pressed on. "I had a sister," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was sick for a long time. Everyone told me to trust the doctors, to follow their instructions, not to question their expertise. So I did. I stayed silent even when I saw that their treatments weren't working. And she died." Her hands trembled slightly as she washed the princess's pale skin. "I promised myself I would never stay silent again. Never stand by while someone suffered just because I was afraid to question what I was told to believe." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft splash of water and the distant howling of wolves beyond the castle walls. Cecilia was beginning to think she'd been wrong, that Seraphine truly couldn't respond, when she heard it, so quiet she almost missed it, a small voice that was perfectly, impossibly articulate. "Please, don't tell him you saw." Cecilia's hands froze in the water. Her eyes snapped to Seraphine's face, and what she saw there made her heart skip several beats. The princess's eyes had focused, truly focused, and were looking directly at her with an awareness and intelligence that no infant should possess. "You can speak." Cecilia breathed, hardly daring to believe it. "You can really speak?" Seraphine's lips barely moved, but the words were clear. "Only when the dawn spell fades," she whispered, her voice desperate and afraid. "Only a little. Only in the evenings before he renews it." Her eyes, so old in that infant face, pleaded with Cecilia. "Please don't tell father. If he knows the binding is weakening, he'll renew it stronger. He'll make sure I can never." Footsteps. Heavy and deliberate, echoing up the spiral staircase. Seraphine's eyes immediately glazed over, consciousness disappearing from them as if it had never been there at all. Her body went utterly limp in Cecilia's hands, head lolling to the side, every trace of awareness vanishing like morning mist. The door opened. Greer's gaunt face appeared in the entrance, his expression as flat and emotionless as always. "His Majesty wishes to know if you require anything for the princess's care." "No," Cecilia managed, fighting to keep her voice steady. Everything is fine. Thank you." Greer studied her for a long moment with those tarnished silver eyes, then nodded once and withdrew, pulling the door closed behind him. Cecilia remained frozen in place, heart hammering, staring down at Seraphine's blank face. "Dawn spell. Binding. Renewed stronger." The words echoed through her mind, each one more terrible than the last. "What dawn spell?" she whispered to the seemingly unconscious princess. "What is being done to you?" But Seraphine gave no answer. Whether because she couldn't or wouldn't, Cecilia didn't know. But as she finished bathing the princess and carried her back to the cradle, one thing had become absolutely certain. Princess Seraphine's disability wasn't natural. It was being maintained, magically imposed. And somehow, it had something to do with whatever King Valus did at dawn. Cecilia laid the princess in her cradle and pulled the silk covering over her small form. "I'm going to find out," she promised in a whisper. "I'm going to understand what's happening to you. And I'm going to help you if I can." Seraphine's eyes stared unseeing at the ceiling, but Cecilia could have sworn she saw the tiniest tremor in the princess's jaw, acknowledgement, perhaps, or hope, or fear. Maybe all three. That night, lying in her narrow cot, Cecilia didn't sleep. Instead, she stared at the darkness and made plans. She would watch more carefully, learn the castle's rhythms, and most importantly, she would discover what happened at dawn in Princess Seraphine's chamber and what spell an immortal king performed on his own daughter every morning while the rest of the castle slept. Cecilia spent the following days moving through her duties like a ghost, her mind consumed by the fragments of truth Seraphine had whispered. Dawn spell. Binding. The words circled endlessly through her thoughts as she scrubbed floors and changed linens, each repetition only deepening the questions that had taken root in her chest. She needed answers, but the servants were bound by blood oaths and terror, their lips sealed as firmly as any lock. Which left only one other possibility, the castle physician. Dr. Corvain kept chambers in the West Wing, accessible through a stone corridor that smelled perpetually of dried herbs and something sharper, more medicinal. Cecilia found him late one evening, hunched over a worktable scattered with glass vials and yellowed parchments, his skeletal frame draped in robes that had once been burgundy but had faded to the color of old blood. He was ancient even by vampire standards, his papery skin stretched tight over prominent bones, his eyes like chips of amber set deep in hollowed sockets. "Dr. Corvain?" Cecilia ventured from the doorway. "I was hoping to speak with you about Princess Seraphine." His hands stilled over the mortar and pestle he'd been working. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Then, very slowly, he turned to face her. What she saw in his expression made her instinctively step backward, not anger, but pure, undiluted terror. "No," he said, the word barely a whisper. "No, no, no. Not again." "I've just noticed some inconsistencies," Cecilia pressed on, though something in his reaction made her skin prickle with warning. "Small things. Movements that seem deliberate rather than reflexive. I thought perhaps you might have observed." "Stop." His voice cracked like breaking ice. He crossed the room with surprising speed for someone so frail, gripping her shoulders with hands that trembled violently. "Do not ask these questions, child. Do not see what you think you see. Do not speak these thoughts aloud." Cecilia pulled free of his grasp, her pulse hammering. "Why not? If there's something wrong with her treatment." "There was a healer," Dr. Corvain said abruptly, his amber eyes darting toward the shadows, as if something might be listening. 15 years ago. A woman skilled in mystical afflictions. She came from the southern courts, highly recommended. She spent 3 months studying the princess." His voice dropped to barely audible. "She said the same things you're noticing. Questioned why certain symptoms didn't align with any known condition. Wondered aloud about magical interference." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush stone. "What happened to her?" Cecilia asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "She disappeared one night. The king said she'd been summoned home urgently. But her belongings remained in her chambers. Her travel cloak still hung by the door. No one has spoken her name since." Dr. Corvain's hands continued to shake as he turned back to his work table. "The king loves his daughter, Miss Cecilia." "Never doubt that. But that love has rules. Follow them or leave. Those are your only choices." He wouldn't meet her eyes again, and when she tried to ask another question, he simply resumed grinding herbs with methodical intensity, as if she'd already ceased to exist. Cecilia left his chambers with ice settling in her stomach. The disappeared healer. The terror in Dr. Corvain's eyes. The warning that felt less like advice and more like prophecy. She should have been frightened enough to stop, to accept what everyone else had accepted and simply perform her duties without question. But all she could think about was Seraphine's desperate whisper, asterisk, please don't tell him you saw asterisk, and the intelligence burning behind those supposedly vacant eyes. If she couldn't get answers from the living, she would have to seek them elsewhere. 3 nights later, when the castle had settled into the deep silence that preceded dawn, Cecilia slipped from her cot and moved through the shadowed corridors like a drift of smoke. She'd learned the guards' patterns by now, knew which staircases creaked and which servants slept lightly. The king's private study occupied the northern tower, accessible only through a gallery lined with portraits of long-dead dravens whose painted eyes seemed to follow her passage with accusatory stares. The study door was unlocked, arrogance or trust, she couldn't say. She eased it open and stepped inside, pulling it closed behind her before daring to breathe. The room was vast, all marble and shadow, with floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes and artifacts that hummed with barely contained power. A massive desk dominated the center, its surface covered in maps and correspondence sealed with wax and ancient symbols. But what drew her attention was the section of shelving in the far corner, draped entirely in black velvet as if to hide its contents from casual view. Cecilia crossed to it on trembling legs and pulled the velvet aside. Dust cascaded down, making her stifle a cough. Behind the cloth sat dozens of grimoires, their spines marked with runes that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. One book in particular called to her, bound in dark leather so old it had gone nearly black, with silver clasps that bore warning symbols she recognized from her limited magical education. The title was embossed in letters that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, Codex Maleficium. She shouldn't touch it. Every instinct screamed at her to step away, to leave this room and forget everything she'd seen. But Seraphine's face floated before her mind's eye, that terrible awareness trapped behind infant features, and Cecilia reached out with shaking hands and unclasped the silver fasteners. The book fell open to a page marked with a strip of crimson silk. An illustration dominated the parchment, a child wreathed in blazing golden light, with vampires falling like shadows before her radiance. Above it, written in elegant script that seemed to pulse with its own energy, she read the words that would change everything. The prophecy of divine motion. Her eyes devoured the text that followed. An airborne during a blood eclipse would possess the gift of divine motion, supernatural strength capable of shattering steel, the ability to walk freely in sunlight that would destroy any other vampire, power to break curses and bindings with nothing more than will and touch. A child who could reshape the very nature of vampire existence. But if this gift awakened before the blood eclipse cycle completed, 347 years, the covenant would shatter, the eternal night would end, and all who bore darkness would burn. Cecilia's breath came in shallow gasps as she turned the page. There, in more clinical language, she found the binding decree. The heir's gift must be sealed through dawn ritual performed each sunrise. Physical disability must be maintained through magical suppression until the appointed time, when the gift may safely manifest without destroying the vampire race. In the margin, written in handwriting she recognized from correspondence she'd seen on Bayless's desk, were words that made her chest constrict. I chose this prison for her. I chose helplessness over death. May she forgive me for the father I had to become. She flipped frantically through more pages until she found what she was looking for, a calculation page covered in dates and astronomical symbols. At the bottom, underlined 3 times in dark ink, blood eclipse cycle, 347 years. Current year, 346. 1 more year until permanent binding possible. 1 more year until she is safe. The book slipped from Cecilia's nerveless fingers and hit the marble floor with a sound like breaking bone. Do not wake the divine motion, mortal. The voice came from the darkness beyond the candlelight, old and cold as grave earth. You cannot comprehend what you risk, what you would unleash upon this world. Cecilia spun toward the sound, her heart slamming against her ribs. She saw nothing but shadow and the gleam of eyes that might have been reflecting candlelight or generating their own hellish glow. Then she heard footsteps, multiple sets, heavy boots on marble, approaching from the corridor beyond. She ran, snatched up the fallen grimoire and fled through a side door she hadn't noticed before, plunging into a servant's passage that twisted through the castle walls like a warren. Behind her, voices shouted in alarm. Ahead, only darkness and the pounding of her own pulse, and the terrible truth clutched against her chest like a live coal. Valus hadn't failed to cure his daughter. He had deliberately crippled her, maintained her helplessness through 3 centuries of magical torment. Not from cruelty, but from love twisted into something monstrous by impossible choice, condemn his child to eternal imprisonment in her own body, or watch her gift destroy every vampire in existence, including herself. 1 year remained. 347 sunrises until the binding could be made permanent, until Seraphine would be trapped forever in that infant form with her divine motion sealed beyond any hope of awakening. And Cecilia alone knew the truth. Cecilia didn't return to her quarters after fleeing the study. She couldn't face the narrow cot and the darkness and the suffocating silence where her thoughts would chase themselves in endless, terrible circles. Instead, she hid the grimoire beneath a loose stone in the kitchen pantry and spent the remaining hours before dawn pacing the servants' corridors, the truth she'd discovered burning through her mind like acid. 346 years. 346 years of deliberately maintained helplessness. 346 years of a father binding his daughter's body and mind every single sunrise, trapping her consciousness behind walls of magical suppression, all to prevent a gift that could save or destroy everything. She understood the reasoning. The prophecy was clear enough. If Seraphine's divine motion awakened before the cycle completed, the covenant would shatter and every vampire in existence would burn, including Seraphine herself. Valus had chosen the lesser evil, the survival of his daughter over her freedom. It was logical, practical, monstrous. But what haunted Cecilia most was the margin note, those words written in a hand that shook with grief. May she forgive me for the father I had to become. The pre-dawn hours arrived with agonizing slowness. The castle settled into that peculiar stillness that preceded sunrise, when even the nocturnal creatures retreated to darkness and the world held its breath between night and day. Cecilia found herself drawn back toward the east tower, her feet carrying her up the spiral staircase before conscious thought could intervene. She needed to see it. Needed to witness what happened each morning in that chamber at the top of the world. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall near Seraphine's door, barely breathing, listening to the silence. Then she heard them footsteps, heavy and deliberate, ascending from below. King Valus, coming to perform the ritual that had defined 3 centuries of his daughter's existence. The footsteps passed within feet of where Cecilia stood frozen in shadow. She heard the door to Seraphine's chamber open, then the soft sound of it closing, but not completely. A sliver of golden candlelight spilled into the corridor through a gap barely wider than her finger. Cecilia moved closer on trembling legs and pressed her eye to that narrow opening. Valus stood in the center of the room, his silver-white hair loose around his shoulders, still wearing the formal robes he'd worn to whatever business had occupied his night. He approached Seraphine's cradle with steps that seemed to carry the weight of mountains, each one deliberate and heavy with purpose. When he reached her side, he sank to his knees on the plush carpet, bringing himself level with his sleeping daughter. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. In the candlelight, his face appeared carved from marble, beautiful and terrible and infinitely sad. Then he reached out with one pale hand and gently brushed a strand of dark hair from Seraphine's forehead. "Forgive me, my precious one," he whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "I do this because I love you, because I cannot lose you as I lost your mother." He positioned both palms against Seraphine's forehead, his long fingers spanning her tiny skull. His eyes closed, and his lips began moving in a chant that made the air itself seem to curdle. The language was ancient and guttural, syllables that hurt to hear, words that predated human civilization and carried power that made Cecilia's teeth ache even through the stone wall. The transformation began without warning. Blue-white light erupted from Velus's hands, so bright that Cecilia had to squint against it. The light poured over Seraphine's small form like liquid fire, sinking into her skin, filling the spaces between her ribs, flowing through her veins in traceries of luminescence. And Seraphine's eyes snapped open. Not the vacant, unfocused stare Cecilia had grown accustomed to, but eyes filled with complete awareness and agony beyond anything Cecilia had ever witnessed. The princess's tiny body convulsed violently, her back arching off the silk bedding, her limbs jerking as if electricity coursed through them. Her mouth opened in what should have been a scream, but no sound emerged. The binding was already taking hold, sealing her voice along with everything else. But her hands moved. Those small, supposedly helpless hands reached upward toward her father's face, not seeking comfort, but pleading. Begging him to stop, to release her, to let her go. Her fingers grasped at his robes, at his wrists, trying desperately to push his hands away from her forehead. Velus didn't stop. His voice rose in volume, the chant becoming almost violent in its intensity, and glowing symbols began appearing on Seraphine's skin. They looked like writing, but in no alphabet Cecilia recognized, burning blue-white against her porcelain flesh before sinking beneath the surface. Each symbol that disappeared made Seraphine's body spasm harder, made her silent mouth open wider in voiceless agony. The ritual couldn't have lasted more than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. When Velus finally lifted his hands and the blue-white light faded, Seraphine's body went completely limp. Her reaching hands fell to her sides. Her eyes remained open, but consciousness drained from them like water through a sieve, leaving only that terrible vacancy Cecilia had mistaken for congenital disability. But there was something new. Thin trails of red streaked from the corners of Seraphine's eyes, cutting paths down her pale cheeks. Blood tears, bright as rubies against her skin. Velus stared at them for a moment, his expression crumbling into something beyond grief. Then, with infinite gentleness, he produced a silk handkerchief and wiped the blood away, his movements careful and tender as if his daughter were made of spun glass. "Just 1 more year, my child," he whispered, his own voice thick with unshed tears. "Then it will never hurt again. Then you'll be safe forever. The binding will be permanent, and you'll never have to endure this ritual again. No more pain. No more morning agony. Just peace. Just safety." He pressed his lips to her forehead where his hands had been. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He lifted Seraphine from the cradle, cradling her against his chest with one arm while carrying the ornate cushioned chair to the window with his other hand. He settled into it, arranging his daughter in his lap, and turned her small face toward the eastern horizon visible through the tall arched glass. Dawn was approaching. Cecilia could see the first hints of light bleeding across the perpetual twilight of Nocturith, turning the darkness from black to deep purple to the palest blue. Velus held Seraphine close, her limp head resting against his shoulder, and together they waited. When the first ray of true sunlight crested the horizon and spilled through the window, it touched Velus's exposed hand. His pale skin immediately began to smoke, a thin tendril rising from his flesh like incense. He hissed softly in pain but didn't move, didn't flinch away. He held his position for another heartbeat, letting the dawn light touch Seraphine's face as well, though her skin showed no reaction, no burning, as if the light recognized something in her that transcended vampire nature. Only when the smoking of his skin intensified did Velus finally retreat from the window, moving back into the safety of shadow. He carried Seraphine to her cradle with the same infinite care, laid her among the silk bedding, and arranged her limbs in that familiar, careful symmetry. Then he stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the edge of the cradle, looking down at his daughter's blank face. "Sweet dreams, my little one," he murmured. "Until tomorrow's dawn." He turned and walked toward the door. Cecilia barely had time to press herself deeper into the shadows before he emerged into the corridor. She held her breath as he passed within inches of her hiding spot, but he seemed lost in his own grief, seeing nothing beyond the path his feet traced through the castle. His footsteps faded down the spiral staircase, growing fainter and fainter until silence reclaimed the tower. Cecilia remained frozen against the wall, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. Behind her closed eyelids, she kept seeing it, Seraphine's body convulsing, her hands reaching and pleading, the terrible awareness in her eyes as her father forced her consciousness back into its prison. The blood tears, the whispered apologies, the promise that in one more year it would all be permanent. One more year until Seraphine would be trapped forever, her divine motion sealed beyond any possibility of awakening, her consciousness bound eternally within a body that could never move or speak or live. She thought of the disappeared healer, Dr. Corvain's terror, the margin note written in a shaking hand. And she understood with crystalline clarity that she stood at an impossible crossroads. She could stay silent, complete her service, and walk away knowing she'd witnessed 3 centuries of suffering disguised as protection. Or she could do something, though what that something might be, she had no idea. All she knew was that she couldn't unknow what she'd seen. Couldn't unhear Seraphine's voiceless screaming or forget the sight of a father torturing his daughter each sunrise in the name of love. Cecilia finally forced herself to move, to flee back down the spiral staircase on legs that barely supported her weight. She reached her quarters as the full dawn broke over Nocturith, painting the perpetual twilight in shades of rose and gold. She collapsed onto her narrow cot, pulled her knees to her chest, and tried not to think about how many more dawns remained before the binding became permanent. Tried not to think about Seraphine lying in her cradle with those vacant eyes, consciousness locked away behind magical bars until tomorrow's ritual renewed her prison. 365 more sunrises. 365 more mornings of voiceless agony. Unless Cecilia found another way. The days following the dawn ritual blurred together in a haze of routine that now felt obscene. Cecilia moved through her duties, bathing, feeding, dressing, but everything had transformed into something grotesque. When she lifted Seraphine from the cradle, she no longer saw a disabled infant, but a prisoner being carried to her cell. When she washed the princess's pale skin, she saw the magical chains binding every muscle, every nerve, forcing stillness where there should have been movement. The porcelain tub became an instrument of torture, the silk gowns a costume for a 3-century performance of helplessness. But in those evening hours when the dawn's spell weakened, when the binding loosened its grip just enough for awareness to seep back through the cracks, Seraphine would whisper fragments of memory that broke Cecilia's heart in new ways each time. "I remember," the princess breathed one evening as Cecilia combed her dark hair with gentle strokes. "Before the binding took full hold. I was 2 years old, by mortal reckoning. I could feel my legs. I could run through the gardens. Mother would chase me laughing." Her voice faded to nothing, and Cecilia had to lean close to hear the rest. "Then she died, and father became afraid, and the binding grew stronger until I couldn't feel anything anymore." Another evening, while Cecilia fed her warmed milk, Seraphine's eyes focused with that terrible clarity, and she said, "He thinks I don't understand. He thinks the curse clouds my mind as well as my body. But I understand everything. I've understood for 3 centuries. Every word he's ever spoken to me. Every apology. Every promise that it will end soon." A single tear traced down her cheek. 346 years of soon, Cecilia. And now there's only 1 year left before soon becomes never. Cecilia found herself torn between sympathy and rage. She'd witnessed Velus's anguish, seen the way his hands trembled as he performed the ritual, heard the breaking in his voice when he apologized to his daughter. He loved Seraphine, that much was undeniable. But he loved her the way a man might love a caged bird, protecting it from the world by ensuring it could never fly. And Cecilia couldn't decide which was worse, a father who tortured his child from cruelty, or one who did it from love twisted into something monstrous by impossible choice. The storm arrived on the 9th evening after Cecilia's discovery, rolling across Nocturith like divine wrath made manifest. Thunder shook the castle foundations hard enough to rattle the ancient stones. Lightning split the perpetual twilight sky in jagged white fissures, illuminating the world in brief, violent bursts that left after images burned across Cecilia's vision. The wind screamed through the towers like something alive and furious, and rain lashed against the windows with enough force to crack the glass. Cecilia was in Seraphine's chamber preparing the evening bath when the first seizure hit. One moment the princess lay quietly in her cradle, eyes vacant and staring at the vaulted ceiling. The next, her body went rigid as iron, every muscle locking simultaneously. But this wasn't like the convulsions Cecilia had witnessed during the dawn ritual. This was violent. Powerful. Seraphine's back arched so sharply Cecilia heard vertebrae pop, and her limbs began thrashing with strength that splintered the ornate wooden cradle beneath her. Blue light erupted from beneath her skin, blazing through her silk nightgown as if her entire body had become a lantern. The light pulsed in rhythm with the lightning outside, growing brighter with each flash until Cecilia had to shield her eyes against the glare. Then Seraphine screamed. Not an infant's cry, but a full-voiced adult scream of agony that seemed to shake the very stones of the tower. The sound was primal and terrible, centuries of voiceless suffering finally given expression, and it didn't stop. It went on, rising and falling with each convulsion, each surge of blue light that threatened to consume her small form entirely. The broken cradle collapsed completely. Seraphine's body rose from the wreckage, levitating 3 feet above the splintered wood, suspended by forces Cecilia couldn't begin to comprehend. The princess's limbs jerked and spasmed, no longer limp but moving with chaotic, terrifying strength. Her fingers clawed at the air as if trying to tear through invisible bonds. Her legs kicked hard enough to crack the stone wall when her heel connected with it. Seraphine. Cecilia lunged forward, arms outstretched, just as the levitation failed. The princess plummeted, and Cecilia caught her barely. The impact drove them both to the floor, Cecilia's knees slamming against carpet and stone. Seraphine writhed in her arms, impossibly strong, her small body radiating heat like a forge. Then her eyes opened, and they blazed with blue-white light so intense Cecilia could see nothing else. No pupils, no irises, just pure luminescence pouring from those infant features. "I can feel it breaking," Seraphine gasped, her voice no longer a whisper but clear and strong and desperate. "The curse is breaking, Cecilia. I can feel my legs. I can feel my arms. I can feel everything." Her hands gripped Cecilia's shoulders with crushing force. "Help me. Help me stand. I want to stand." Cecilia tried to help her upright, but the moment Seraphine's feet touched the floor, her legs buckled. She collapsed forward, and blood began pouring from her nose in a crimson flood. More blood leaked from the corners of her eyes, from her ears, staining her porcelain skin. She convulsed in Cecilia's arms, her body caught between the curse trying to reassert itself and whatever force was tearing it apart. "It hurts," she sobbed, blood bubbling from her lips. "Why does freedom hurt so much? Why does it feel like I'm being ripped apart?" Her glowing eyes rolled back, and her body went rigid again. When she spoke next, her voice sounded distant, as if she were seeing something far beyond this room. "I see it. I see the sun rising over the castle. I see Father standing in the courtyard. I see him burning." Her voice rose to a shriek. "His skin is on fire. His hair is smoking. He's screaming my name. No, and oh, I don't want this. I don't want him to burn. The door to the chamber exploded inward with enough force to tear it from its hinges. Velis stood in the doorway, and Cecilia barely recognized him. Gone was the sorrowful, gentle father who bathed his daughter with infinite care. This was the vampire king, terror of realms, immortal predator whose rage could shatter armies. His crimson eyes burned like coals, his silver hair whipped around his face as if caught in its own private storm, and his expression was transformed by fury and fear so profound it made him look inhuman. He crossed the room in a blur of motion and tore Seraphine from Cecilia's arms with enough force to send Cecilia sprawling backward. "What have you done?" he roared, cradling his convulsing daughter against his chest. The binding held for 346 years. Now, mere weeks after you arrive, it fractures. "I didn't," Cecilia tried to speak, but Velis silenced her with a look that promised violence. "Don't lie to me, mortal. I can smell the residue of forbidden knowledge on you. You've been in my study. You've read the texts." He held Seraphine tighter as she continued to convulse, blue light still pulsing beneath her skin. "Did you use dark magic? Did you deliberately weaken the spell? Do you have any comprehension of what you've risked?" "Your Majesty, I swear." "Guards." His voice shook the stones. "Take her to the dungeons. Chain her with iron blessed in holy water. She will not interfere again." Two vampire guards materialized in the doorway, their faces expressionless, their hands reaching for Cecilia. She tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go, the wall hard against her spine. "Father." The single word froze everyone in place. It hadn't been a whisper or a cry, but clear speech, unmistakable and deliberate. Velis's head snapped down to look at his daughter. Seraphine lay in his arms, blood still streaming from her nose and eyes, but her voice emerged steady despite the pain racking her small body. "Father, no," she said again, each word an obvious effort. "She didn't do this. She didn't weaken anything. Please." Velis stared at his daughter as if seeing a ghost. In 346 years, she had never spoken his name, never formed a complete sentence, never intervened on anyone's behalf. The shock of it rendered him motionless, his rage draining away and leaving only confusion in its wake. "Don't send her away," Seraphine continued, lifting one trembling hand to touch her father's face. The gesture was weak, but it was there, deliberate, conscious, real. "She's the only one who sees me, Father. The only one who knows I'm still here, inside this prison you've built. She's the only one who treats me like I'm a person instead of a curse that needs containing." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to collapse the tower. Outside, thunder continued to shake the sky, and lightning painted the room in intermittent flashes of white. But inside the chamber, everything had gone still. The guards remained frozen in the doorway. Cecilia pressed against the wall, barely daring to breathe. And Velis stood holding his daughter, staring at her bloody face with an expression that cycled through shock, grief, wonder, and terror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. His voice emerged quiet, drained of all rage. "Go to your quarters, Cecilia. We will speak at dusk tomorrow. Do not attempt to leave the castle. Do not speak of this to anyone." His crimson eyes lifted to meet hers, and what she saw there was no longer fury, but something far more dangerous, a father realizing that his carefully constructed world was crumbling, and he had no idea how to stop it. "If you value your life, you will pray I find a way to repair what's breaking." He turned and carried Seraphine toward the door, his movements careful despite his obvious turmoil. As he passed through the doorway, Cecilia heard him whisper to his daughter, "You spoke. After all these centuries, you finally spoke to me." And Seraphine's weak reply, barely audible, "I've been trying to speak to you for 300 years, Father. You just never heard me." Then they were gone, leaving Cecilia alone in the ruined chamber with splintered wood and blood-stained carpet and the terrible knowledge that the curse was breaking, and when it finally shattered completely, either Seraphine would be free or the entire vampire race would burn. Cecilia was summoned to the throne chamber as the sun set, painting Noctiritha's perpetual twilight in shades of blood and amber. 2 guards escorted her through corridors she'd never walked before, past tapestries depicting ancient battles and portraits of dravens long turned to dust. The throne room itself was a cavern of black marble and shadow, lit by iron braziers that cast dancing light across vaulted ceilings so high they disappeared into darkness. Velis sat upon an obsidian throne that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. His silver hair hung unbound past his shoulders, wild and unkempt in a way Cecilia had never seen. His crimson eyes were hollow, shadowed by exhaustion that made him look centuries older than his ageless face suggested. He didn't rise when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence at all for a long moment, simply stared at something only he could see. "You want to understand," he finally said, his voice echoing through the empty chamber. "Very well. You will understand everything. And then you will see why what you're doing is not mercy, it is murder." Cecilia remained silent, hands clasped before her, waiting. 900 years ago, before your civilization even learned to forge steel, my ancestors made a covenant with the moon goddess. Velis's gaze remained distant, lost in memory. She granted us immortality, strength beyond mortal comprehension, freedom from disease and age. But every gift demands a price. Ours was this. No heir of the Draven line would possess the divine motion until the blood eclipse cycle completed. 347 years of binding. 347 years to ensure the gift would manifest safely, without destroying the covenant that sustained us all. His hands gripped the arms of the throne, knuckles white. My wife carried Seraphine through that entire pregnancy knowing what was coming. Knowing the birth would fall during the blood eclipse. Knowing the prophecy would be tested. His voice cracked. She died in childbirth. Her last words were, "Save our daughter." And I held my newborn child, still covered in her mother's blood, and watched her glow with divine power. Cecilia felt her throat tighten, but she said nothing. Seraphine was born moving, Cecilia. Born aware. Her tiny hands grasped my fingers with strength that could have crushed bone. Her eyes blazed with blue-white light and tracked my every movement with complete consciousness. She was perfect. And the vampire courts demanded I kill her immediately. He finally looked at Cecilia, and the pain in his eyes was bottomless. They assembled outside my chambers with silver blades and holy fire. They said the prophecy was beginning. That if I didn't end her life, she would end all of ours. I held my newborn daughter, still covered in her mother's blood, and I had to choose, kill her to save my kingdom, or find another way. His voice dropped to barely audible. I found the binding in forbidden texts that night. An ancient ritual that could suppress the divine motion without death. Trap it. Contain it. Until the cycle completed and it could be permanently sealed. He rose from the throne and descended the steps, each movement heavy with centuries of grief. The first ritual was at dawn the morning after her birth. I knelt beside her cradle and pressed my hands to her forehead and began the chant. He stopped in front of Cecilia, close enough that she could see the unshed blood tears gathering in his eyes. She looked at me with such betrayal, such understanding. She knew what I was taking from her, even then. She was 1 day old, and she understood I was choosing to cripple her. 346 years, Cecilia. 346 years of daily rituals. Watching her suffer. Watching her consciousness retreat behind walls I built with my own magic. Knowing she's trapped inside that prison, aware of everything, unable to move or speak or live. His voice broke completely. Do you know what it costs me? Every dawn, I curse my own child. Every dawn, I see her eyes plead with me to stop. Every dawn, I choose my kingdom over her freedom because I don't know what else to do. Cecilia found her voice, though it trembled. But in 1 year, the cycle completes. Velis finished. The binding can be made permanent and painless. She'll be comfortable, cared for, protected. She'll never suffer another ritual. Never endure another moment of pain. She'll live forever in peace. his hands clenched at his sides. Is that not worth one more year of suffering? One more year and she'll be safe. You mean she'll be imprisoned forever? The words escaped before Cecilia could stop them. Comfortable but powerless. Safe but not free. You're not planning to protect her for one more year. You're planning to trap her for eternity. Free to do what? Velas's voice rose, rage returning. Destroy herself? She's been helpless for 3 centuries, girl. If her gift awakens, she'll walk into sunlight out of curiosity and burn. She'll use her strength without understanding it and hurt herself. She doesn't know how to use a body that works. Freedom would kill her faster than any binding. And every vampire in this kingdom will burn, he continued, his voice gaining strength. Thousands of souls. Families. Children. All dead so one person can walk. So my daughter can take a few steps before the sun reduces her to ash. Tell me, Cecilia, is that the mercy you're offering her? Death and genocide. You're not protecting her. Cecilia's voice was steady now, certainty hardening in her chest. You're protecting yourself from losing her. You'd rather she live forever as a prisoner than risk her freedom, because you can't bear the thought of watching her die like her mother did. Velas's eyes blazed crimson. You dare. I dare because I did the same thing. The words burst from her like a dam breaking. My sister was dying, and the doctors gave orders, and I followed every single one. They said not to question them, not to suggest alternatives. Just trust their expertise and do what I was told. So I obeyed. I watched her waste away while I administered useless treatments and followed protocols that weren't working, and I stayed silent because I was afraid to defy authority. And she died. Cecilia stepped closer, meeting his burning gaze. You're doing the same thing. Choosing obedience to fear over faith in your daughter. You're so terrified of the prophecy, so afraid of losing her, that you'd rather guarantee her imprisonment than risk her freedom. That's not protection. That's control disguised as love. The silence that followed was absolute. Velas stared at her with an expression that cycled through fury, grief, recognition, and something that might have been shame. His hands trembled at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. Get out. He turned away from her, climbing back toward his throne with steps that seemed to carry impossible weight. Get out before I forget she spoke for you. Before I forget that you're the only person in 346 years who's seen my daughter as something other than a curse to be managed. He collapsed onto the obsidian throne and covered his face with both hands. 1 year remains, he whispered through his fingers. In 1 year, this ends. The binding becomes permanent, and Seraphine will finally be at peace. She'll forgive me eventually. She has to. I did everything for her. Everything. But his voice carried no conviction, only desperate hope that repetition might make it true. Cecilia left him there in his throne room of shadows, a king drowning in the consequences of impossible choices, and she understood with terrible clarity that there were no heroes in this story. Only people trying to prevent catastrophe through methods that guaranteed suffering, and the prisoner caught between prophecy and protection, unable to choose her own fate. Cecilia's decision crystallized in the hours before dawn, alone in her narrow quarters while the castle slept. She had seen too much, understood too much, to turn away now. The disappeared healer. Her sister's death. 3 centuries of suffering disguised as protection. All of it led to this single, impossible conclusion: she would free Seraphine. Whatever the cost. She waited until the deepest part of night, when even vampires retreated to their day chambers and the corridors lay empty as tombs. Then she moved through shadow to Velas's study, her footsteps silent on ancient stone. The Codex Maleficium sat where the guards had replaced it after confiscating it from her, hidden behind black velvet as if cloth could contain the dangerous knowledge within its pages. Her hands trembled as she opened it, flipping past the prophecy to sections near the back marked with warnings in 3 dead languages. There, reversal of divine motion binding. The ritual was complex, requiring blood from the bound one, blood from one who believed in her freedom, a circle drawn in ash from moon sage, and words of power spoken at the precise moment between night and dawn when magic hung suspended between darkness and light. She was copying the incantation onto a scrap of parchment when the temperature in the study dropped until her breath misted in the air. A figure materialized beside the desk, translucent, luminous, a woman in flowing gowns that seemed woven from moonlight itself. Her face was achingly beautiful, with the same delicate features Seraphine possessed, and eyes that held both sorrow and fierce determination. "You have her spirit," the ghost said, her voice like wind through leaves. "That same defiance. That same courage." Cecilia's throat constricted. "You're Seraphine's mother. I am what remains of her." The ghost drifted closer, studying Cecilia with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "My husband made his choice from love. I don't doubt that. But love without faith is just fear wearing a gentle mask. He's so afraid of losing her that he's guaranteed she'll never truly live." "I'm going to free her," Cecilia whispered. "I know. That's why I've come." The ghost's form flickered like a candle in wind. "Free my daughter. Let her walk even if it's only for one dawn. Let her know her own strength, her own choice, even if it kills her. That's worth more than an eternity of comfortable imprisonment." The ghost began fading, her edges dissolving into mist. Her final words came as barely a breath. "The castle has eyes. Move quickly." The warning came too late. Guards poured through the study door like a dark tide, their faces grim, their hands seizing Cecilia's arms with crushing strength. The codex was torn from her grip. She was dragged through corridors and down spiral stairs that descended far beneath the castle's foundations, into dungeons carved from living bedrock where no light penetrated and the air tasted of centuries of despair. They threw her into a cell and slammed the iron door with finality that echoed through stone. The darkness was absolute. Cecilia pressed her back against the cold wall and tried not to think about the disappeared healer, about blood oaths and vampire justice, and how Longbones took to turn to dust in places like this. "You asked the forbidden questions." The voice came from the adjacent cell, ancient and papery. "I knew someone would, eventually." Cecilia turned toward the sound. In the faint phosphorescence of cave moss, she could make out a figure skeletal thin, skin like parchment stretched over bone, eyes clouded with cataracts, but somehow still seeing. "Who are you?" "I am Scholar Thorn. I asked the same questions as you 30 years ago. Noticed the same inconsistencies. Saw the same truth." A dry laugh rattled from the ancient vampire's chest. "I've been here since. But I learned something in my imprisonment. The king's love is a cage, but cages can be broken from inside or out." Movement in the darkness. Something metallic scraped against stone. "I've kept this hidden for 3 decades, Thorn whispered, waiting for someone worthy. An ancient iron key slid through the gap between their cells, glinting dully in the moss light. "I made a promise to the queen before she died," Thorn continued. "I would help her daughter if ever she needed freedom." The guards change rotation at dawn. "You have perhaps 10 minutes. The ritual, you studied it well." "Yes." Cecilia's hand closed around the key, its metal warm as if it held trapped sunlight. "Then go. Now. And tell the princess that some of us never stopped believing she deserved better." The key turned smoothly despite centuries of disuse. Cecilia emerged into the corridor and ran, taking stairs 3 at a time, racing against the approaching dawn. The castle was silent, its inhabitants either sleeping or preparing for the morning's routines. She reached the east tower gasping, legs burning, and burst through Seraphine's door. The princess lay in her cradle, but her eyes were open, truly open, focused and aware. The curse always weakened just before the dawn ritual, those final moments when yesterday's binding faded and today's hadn't yet taken hold. "Cecilia." Seraphine's voice was barely audible. "You came back. I'm taking you somewhere safe." Cecilia lifted her from the cradle, so light, impossibly fragile, like carrying a bundle of silk and moonbeams. "Do you trust me?" Seraphine nodded, her small arms wrapping around Cecilia's neck with what little strength she possessed. They fled through servant passages to the catacombs where ancient Draven kings rested in stone sarcophagi. Cecilia laid Seraphine on the cold floor between two coffins and began the ritual with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She traced the circle in moon sage ash she'd stolen from the apothecary, cut her palm with a silver blade, and let blood fall onto symbols that glowed faintly as they absorbed it. Positioned Seraphine in the circle's center and began the incantation, words in a language that predated human civilization flowing from her lips, as if she'd always known them. Magic ignited. Blue light crawled up Seraphine's body like living flame, writhing across her skin in patterns that burned themselves into Cecilia's vision. The princess's back arched, her small form rigid with power that had been trapped for centuries finally finding release. "Stop this madness." Valus appeared in the catacombs entrance, his face twisted with terror and rage that made him look monstrous. He rushed forward, silver hair streaming behind him, but an invisible barrier threw him backward against the stone wall with force that cracked the ancient masonry. Cecilia continued chanting, her voice growing stronger as the ritual built toward its crescendo. Valus hammered against the barrier with fists that could shatter steel, but the magic held firm. "You don't understand what you're doing." His voice was raw with desperation. "The prophecy, when the binding breaks, every vampire in Nocturith burns. My daughter burns. You're killing her." Cecilia shouted over the rising wind that whipped through the catacombs. "I understand that your daughter deserves to choose. Even if she chooses to burn, it should be her choice, not yours." She pressed her bleeding palm against Seraphine's forehead, completing the final component of the ritual. Blinding light erupted outward, silver blue flames that consumed everything in their radius. Seraphine screamed, a sound that contained both agony and liberation, centuries of voiceless suffering finally given voice. Her body convulsed violently as the ancient binding symbols rose to the surface of her skin, glowing white-hot before shattering like glass. Each broken symbol released a pulse of energy that shook the catacombs' foundations. Stone coffins cracked open. Dust rained from the vaulted ceiling. The light grew impossibly bright, forcing Cecilia to shield her eyes. Then, with a sound like the world splitting along invisible seams, the curse broke. The light faded slowly, leaving after images burned across Cecilia's vision. Silence fell, heavy and complete. Seraphine lay in the circle's center, gasping for breath, her small chest heaving. For a long moment, she didn't move, and Cecilia's heart seized with terror that the ritual had failed, that she'd destroyed rather than freed. Then, slowly and deliberately, Seraphine moved her hand. Her own movement. Her choice. She pushed herself up to sitting position, movements jerky and uncertain but unmistakably intentional. She stared at her hands as if seeing them for the first time, flexing fingers that obeyed her will. Wonder transformed her face, 3 centuries of helplessness giving way to something like joy. She tried to stand. Her legs trembled violently, unused to bearing weight, and she would have fallen if Cecilia hadn't rushed forward to support her. 1 step, 2 steps. Then her strength gave out and she collapsed into Cecilia's arms. But she was smiling, really smiling, an expression of pure, transcendent happiness that made her look nothing like the blank-faced infant everyone had known for 3 centuries. "I'm standing," she breathed, wonder making her voice shake. "Cecilia, I'm standing. My legs are moving because I told them to move." She looked past Cecilia to where Valus remained trapped behind the fading barrier, his face a mask of shock and grief, and something that might have been awe. Their eyes met across the distance, father and daughter truly seeing each other for the first time in 346 years. "Father," Seraphine whispered, and even that single word cost her visible effort. "I'm sorry, but I had to be free, even if it's only for a moment." even if it kills me. I had to know what it felt like to choose. The barrier dissipated completely. Valus could have rushed forward, could have tried to reverse the ritual or imprison them both. Instead, he remained frozen against the cracked wall, staring at his daughter as she stood on trembling legs, supported by a mortal girl who defied a king for the sake of someone else's freedom. And for the first time in centuries, the vampire king wept. The breaking of the curse sent shockwaves through the castle's ancient magic like cracks spreading through ice. Cecilia felt it first as a tremor in the stones beneath her feet, then as a groan that seemed to come from the fortress itself, 3 centuries of enchantment unraveling all at once. Sunlight began penetrating walls that had been sealed against it for 700 years. Fissures appeared in the vaulted ceiling of the catacombs, letting through thin beams of golden dawn that should have been impossible. They climbed from the depths together, Valus moving like a man in a trance, Cecilia supporting Seraphine who walked with halting, uncertain steps, learning the weight and balance of her own body for the first time. Each stair was a triumph. Each movement of legs that obeyed her will brought fresh tears of wonder to the princess's eyes. The castle transformed around them. Stained glass windows that had been dark for centuries suddenly blazed with color as true sunlight struck them. Rainbow lights scattered through halls that had known only shadow and candle flame, painting the ancient stone in hues of sapphire, emerald, and crimson. Servants emerged from their quarters, staring in shock at the impossible dawn flooding through cracks in walls and ceiling. They reached the throne chamber as the sun crested the horizon fully. The eastern windows, massive arched expanses of crystal that had been shuttered since the blood eclipse, suddenly blazed with golden light that poured into the room like liquid fire. The obsidian throne gleamed. The marble floor became a mirror of dawn. Valus stood at the threshold between shadow and light, his body still protected by the overhang of the doorway. But his pale skin had already begun to smoke where stray beams touched the edge of his hand. The scent of burning flesh filled the air, acrid and terrible. Seraphine saw it clearly for the first time, truly saw her father, not through the fog of the curse, but with eyes that focused and comprehended. She took 3 trembling steps toward him, her legs wobbling but holding. "Father, no. Get back into the shadows." Valus caught her hands, stopping her progress, and the smile that crossed his face was heartbreaking in its bittersweetness. "Look at you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Standing on your own. Speaking clearly. Everything your mother dreamed for you when she held you for those few precious moments before," his voice broke. "Everything I was too afraid to let you become." His skin continued to smoke where the light touched it, and silver flames began licking at the edges of his form, not the consuming fire that destroyed lesser vampires, but something slower, more deliberate, as if the sun itself was claiming him gently. "I was so afraid of losing you that I lost you anyway," he continued, his crimson eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "I lost 3 centuries of knowing the real you, of hearing your voice, seeing you smile, watching you discover the world. I was so busy protecting you from death that I forgot to let you live." Seraphine was crying, blood tears streaking her cheeks. "Please, step back into the shadows. Please don't leave me. I just found you, the real you, not the jailer, not the protector. My father." Valus cupped her face in his dissolving hands, his touch infinitely gentle. The silver flames were spreading now, climbing his arms, but he showed no pain. Only peace. "You were never the one who needed saving, my precious girl. I was. I needed saving from my fear, from the prison I built around both of us disguised as love." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I loved you so much I forgot to trust you. Forgive me." Then, before Seraphine could respond, he stepped fully into the sunlight. Not in defeat, not in despair, but in acceptance, in release, in a final act of faith in the daughter he'd spent centuries trying to control. Silver flames engulfed him completely, wreathing his tall form in luminescence that rivaled the dawn itself. He didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't try to retreat to safety. Instead, he turned his face toward the sunrise, the same sun his daughter could finally see without burning, and his expression was transcendent. "Be everything I was too afraid to let you be," he said, his voice carrying despite the flames. "Be free. Be strong. Be yourself." Then Valus Draven, Vampire King, eternal ruler of Nocturith, dissolved into silver ash that caught the morning light like falling snow. The particles drifted through the throne chamber in lazy spirals, beautiful and terrible, until they settled like frost across the marble floor. Only his crown remained, clattering against stone with a sound of finality. Seraphine's legs gave out. Cecilia barely caught her before she hit the floor, and they sank together, the princess sobbing into Cecilia's shoulder with a grief so raw it seemed to tear from her chest. "I'm free," she gasped between sobs. "I'm finally free. Why does it hurt so much to be free?" Cecilia held her tighter, her own tears falling into Seraphine's dark hair. "Because freedom always costs something. But you're here. You're standing. You're real." And he knew that was worth any price. Throughout the castle, the sounds of chaos echoed, servants screaming, vampires fleeing to deep cellars and windowless chambers, some perishing as the Covenant's breaking exposed them to light they could no longer endure. But others, the youngest, stepped tentatively into the dawn and discovered they could bear it. The curse was truly broken, the Covenant shattered, and a new order was emerging from the ruins of the old. Days passed. Seraphine learned to walk properly, her muscles growing stronger with each sunrise. She still fell sometimes, her body not yet fully understanding its own capabilities, but Cecilia was always there to catch her. They explored the castle together, the library filled with ancient tomes, the gardens where night-blooming flowers now shared space with roses that opened to daylight, rooms Seraphine had only been carried through as a helpless infant but could now enter on her own feet. Each discovery brought tears of wonder. The feel of pages turning beneath her own fingers, the sensation of grass beneath her bare feet, the weight of silverware in her hand as she fed herself for the first time. Simple things that everyone else took for granted became miracles. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Seraphine stood on the highest balcony overlooking her kingdom. Cecilia found her there, silhouetted against the sunset, and joined her in companionable silence. "I've been thinking about what to do," Seraphine said finally, not taking her eyes from the horizon. "How to honor what father sacrificed." She turned to Cecilia, and her expression was determined. "I'll rebuild this kingdom. Not as a realm of eternal night, nor one of endless day, but a place where darkness and light coexist, where those who need shadows can find them, and those who need sun can have it." She gestured toward the castle below, where some windows glowed with candlelight while others stood open to the evening breeze. "A kingdom where no one has to choose between safety and freedom, where protection doesn't require imprisonment, where love doesn't have to be a cage." She took Cecilia's hand, squeezing gently. "Will you help me? You freed me from one prison. Help me make sure no one else needs freeing." Cecilia squeezed back, warmth blooming in her chest. "Always. We'll do it together." Seraphine's smile was radiant, not the blank expression of a cursed infant, but the genuine joy of a young woman discovering herself and her purpose. Together. Weeks later, Seraphine stood in the throne room where her father had dissolved into ash. His crown rested on the table before her, heavy with history and grief. She didn't wear it, couldn't bear that weight yet, might never bear it. Instead, she placed it carefully in a glass case beside her mother's portrait, where both parents could watch over the kingdom they'd loved in their different, imperfect ways. "You both loved me," she whispered to the portrait and the crown. "Mother gave me life. Father gave me time. Cecilia gave me freedom. Now I give myself choice." She turned to the window where stars were beginning to appear in the twilight sky. Her steps were strong now, confident, as she crossed to the glass. She looked out over her kingdom where lights flickered on in a pattern that mixed shadow and illumination, some choosing darkness, others embracing light, all finally free to decide for themselves. Cecilia entered quietly. "The council is ready to meet with you." Seraphine took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Let them come. I have much to learn about ruling." She glanced back with a smile that held both determination and hope. "But I'll learn on my feet." They shared a look, survivor and liberator, princess and friend, two souls who'd saved each other in the breaking of ancient chains. Together, they walked toward the council chamber, toward the future they would build from the ruins of impossible choices and 3 centuries of misguided love. When the imprisoned princess finally stood, the kingdom learned that true strength isn't found in control, but in trust. That real love doesn't cage, it empowers. That sometimes the greatest act of devotion is letting go. And in a castle where dawn and dusk now danced together, where the helpless became powerful and the servant became family, a new story began. One of healing, rebuilding, and a bond forged in the breaking of ancient chains, a story of what happens when someone finally has the courage to say, "You deserve to choose your own fate, even if that choice terrifies me." If this story of courage and sacrifice moved you, show some love with a like and subscribe for more tales where darkness and light find balance. What would you have done in Cecilia's place, respected the father's protection, or fought for the daughter's freedom? Let us know in the comments. And remember, sometimes the most loving thing we can do is trust someone enough to let them fall, so they can learn to stand on their own.